And so in the lead up to the Iran war, I was pretty shocked to see just the amount of influence that the Israeli lobby, but it's much more complicated than the Israeli lobby, to see their influence. Now, obviously, I believed in Ron Paul's message in 2008. And so I already thought a certain way about our foreign policy. I believed in President Trump's message in 2016, 2020, and 24. I had read a good deal about, the Israeli lobby and all the different military industrial complex lobbying mechanisms that are out there. But I didn't understand it until I saw it up close and personal. I'll just share a little bit of that with you guys right now, because I think it's important context for us to have as we enter this next part of the war, and how we can hopefully extract ourselves from it before we have a massive disaster in the Middle East. So in the lead up to the first iteration of the war, the 12-day war and Operation Midnight Hammer, initially, President Trump was very bullish on the negotiations, and he had every right to be bullish on the negotiations, because the Iranians themselves had basically agreed to come to the negotiating table. And they didn't just tell us that, they showed us that. When President Trump came back into the Oval Office in January, the Iranians did a couple, I think, pretty remarkable things. They stopped having their proxies attack our forces in the Middle East. Under the Biden administration, the Iranians saw weakness. They knew that Biden was weak. And after October 7th, they enabled their proxies in Iraq, Syria, a lot of them in Hezbollah as well, to attack our forces. But primarily our forces who were still in Iraq and Syria were attacked around 200 times. Now, I don't think they should have been there. I think our bases, and this is proven to be true, our bases in the region were more of a liability than they were an asset. But our forces were under heavy fire under the Biden administration. Right when Trump came in, the proxies stopped attacking. And so the Iranians said, hey, we're going to withhold the proxies from attacking. And then they also agreed immediately to get to the negotiating table. That was because President Trump and the Iranians agreed on a starting point. They agreed on the biggest part of the so-called nuclear agreement. President Trump had always said, and he continues to say this sometimes, and it's very interesting to watch the language that he uses and when that language changes. President Trump had always said, and he continues to say, that Iran can't have a nuclear bomb. Well, the good news is the Iranians, under the previous supreme leader before we killed him, said Iran can't have a nuclear bomb as well. And this wasn't just words on paper. It was a religious decree, and you can even take the religious decree and say, I don't care what a fatwa is. They're just going to break it anyways. However, Iran had self-enforced this red line since 2003. So if the Iranians wanted to have a nuclear weapon, they would have had a nuclear weapon long before President Trump even came down the golden escalator. So the Iranians were holding that line on their own. They had a self-prohibition on developing a nuclear weapon, and President Trump said Iran can't have a nuclear weapon. President Trump's the art of the deal. That gets you at the negotiating table. You agree on first principles. This is what gave us a lot of hope for there to actually be a nuclear deal. If you rewind to about a year ago, and you can still find these clips online, you'd see Steve Witkoff on the Sunday shows on Fox News talking about the different levels of enrichment that might be tolerable, how the enrichment would be observed. Because basically at this point, we were just working out the details of a deal between us and Iran. But then something very interesting happened, and this is what really alarmed me. I think something that we all need to be aware of. I think, like Marjorie said, I think a lot of you have been more aware of this longer than most Americans have. But it was an eye-opener for me. It wasn't just one Israeli official came in. It wasn't just that Bibi came to the White House. What I saw, and I described this a little bit in my resignation letter, is that there was an echo chamber that was developed around President Trump. And the echo chamber is pretty sophisticated. You would have senior Israeli officials who would come in and do their official engagements with us, with Americans, whether it was in the intelligence community, diplomats, or other just long-standing relationships. They would come in. They would talk with us. They would speak with the president as well. And then you'd have the donor network that would come in, and also they have a certain degree of access to the president. But then you have a very sophisticated media campaign that was used on Fox News, the Wall Street Journal, various think tanks throughout Washington, D.C., the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, et cetera. They all kind of in unison around this time last year, probably starting in March or so, they started saying, the American policy is zero enrichment. And they just kept echoing it over and over again. And suddenly, before you know it, this is actually getting said and repeated by American officials that Iran can't have any enrichment. Now, the Israelis are smart. The Israelis knew that zero enrichment was a red line for Iran. It was essentially a poison pill to kill the deal. And now, people will say, why do the Iranians need enrichment? If they have any enrichment, they're going to develop a nuclear bomb. I say, don't trust what anybody says, but look at their behavior. They've had the fatwa, the prohibition in place since 2003. If these guys wanted a nuclear weapon, they would have had it by now. They're also a very oil-rich country. They simply could have just traded enough oil or other commodities with Pakistan or someone else to get a nuclear bomb. So they are self-regulating. They don't want the nuclear bomb, but they're smart. The Iranians are actually pretty astute observers of the region and American foreign policy. So the Iranians watched us, the American government, under multiple presidents, basically say, hey, if you have any kind of nuclear enrichment capability, we'll go after you, like we went after Saddam Hussein. If you say you may have a nuclear weapon, if you're going to hide any kind of nuclear production enrichment that you have, you get the Iraq treatment. Now, if you go the Gaddafi route in Libya and you say, okay, I'll be above the board with you guys, here's all my nuclear enrichment, here's all of our ability to make any kind of nuclear weapon, then you get the Gaddafi treatment. So what the Iranians had developed actually was based off of the policies that we enacted, and they basically have what I like to call the Goldilocks method for enrichment. They want the ability to be a threshold state, to have enough where they could have a nuclear weapon, but they don't want a nuclear weapon. That gives them, I'd say, their national pride, their national dignity, but it also makes it so that they can't be toppled so easily. So it was really important for the Israelis from their perspective to move that red line, because the Iranians, and you'll still hear them say this, they're not going to back off on enrichment. So basically by saying the U.S. policy, by having that interjected into the U.S. Foreign policy doctrine of saying Iran can't have any enrichment, we killed any potential for the deal. Now, President Trump, this was controversial. We weighed the merits of knocking out the Iranian nuclear facilities, essentially to take the issue of enrichment off the table. Now, obviously, that was risky because it could have started a wider war. However, once again, the Iranians, and I'm not saying this as a spokesman for the Iranians, I'm an American, I did 11 combat tours for my country. However, the Iranians, after Midnight Hammer, showed that they wanted to get back to the negotiating table. They showed that by their actions. After Midnight Hammer, when we bombed their nuclear facilities, the Iranians shot back an equal number of missiles as we dropped bombs on their nuclear facilities, and then they said, hey, we're ready to negotiate. And they shot those missiles at basically an empty quadrant of one of our bases in Qatar. And as we've seen in this second iteration of fighting, if the Iranians wanted to be accurate, they could have been accurate. So after the 12-day war, after we kind of pretty much lied to them about the negotiations, the Israelis kicked off the 12-day war. The Iranians, despite all that, were willing to get back to the negotiating table with us because they knew there could be a deal there. And our guys got back to the negotiating table with them. But this enrichment issue kept coming back up. And this is when we saw a lot of dissenting voices within the administration. We were kind of blocked away from President Trump and not allowed to kind of give him alternative views. And the Israeli echo chamber kicked into overdrive. We saw them constantly on the media, constantly engaging with President Trump. But I still believe that President Trump did not want to get sucked into this war. The problem that we have is that we always refuse to take things away from the Israelis that would prevent them from going on the offense. Even before the 12-day war, some of us were kind of looking at how we could prevent the Israelis from going and doing strikes inside of Iran, because the Israeli calculus basically was, if they can kick the bear enough over in Iran, then we will get hit back and then we will be sucked into the war. And the Israelis' goal this entire time, and they're really not shy about this at all, their entire goal is regime change, but regime change in the American mind, because I think we're fairly simplistic, straightforward thinkers in the West. In the American mind, when we think regime change, we think Saddam Hussein. Like, we're going to roll in there, we're going to knock out the regime, and we're going to militarily dominate them, and it's going to be over. If we have to occupy, we have to occupy. That's regime change in the American mind. The Israelis think much differently, and the Israelis have a much higher tolerance for chaos. Like, Americans will never come out and be like, our goal is chaos. Like, we won't say that. That doesn't sell well. I don't care what side of the aisle you're on. Military planning doesn't thrive on chaos. However, the Israelis, being from that region, they understand chaos and they can thrive in chaos. And it is part of their national defense strategy. So the Israelis are completely comfortable with going over and continuing to kill Iranian leaders until the regime falls. And if the regime falls into chaos and there's no one to actually replace the leadership there, the Israelis are fine with that too, because in their mind, if Iran becomes like Lebanon is to a certain degree, like Iraq was during the height of our involvement there, where it's just chaotic, or like Syria was for the better part of a decade, well, then the Iranians can't pose much of a threat to Israel. Too bad for everybody else who has to deal with that chaos. Their national security objectives are met. So we had a very hard time of separating our goals from the Israelis' goals, because the Israelis are very good at coming to us and saying, hey, we have better intelligence than you guys do. And in many cases they do. And that's a place where I think our intelligence community needs to do a lot more work. And they would say, hey, the Iranians are developing a nuclear weapon, et cetera. We would check it in our systems and our intelligence, and we just simply wouldn't see that. But the Israelis were very, very persistent with their messaging. And so we knew within the U.S. government that more than likely the Israelis were going to go back and take another swing at the Iranians, this time going for a regime decapitation, which at the same time, we also knew that, hey, the Iranians would not be restrained this time. They would view this as the existential threat. Basically, the final round, negotiations are done. They've got to protect theirs. So we knew they would strike back at our bases in the region. And so our task at the time was to see if we could basically take away enough military equipment and support from the Israelis to prevent them from going on the offense. And in my mind, that was how we could have prevented not just the 12-day war, but this second iteration. But we never had the fortitude or the courage to go to the Israelis and say, hey, we pay for everything in your military. We pay for your entire defense. We'll pay for your defense, but we will not pay for you guys to go on the offense. We just simply refused to do that. And so the Israelis, realizing that Trump was back at the negotiating table throughout the summer, throughout the fall and the winter, they were afraid that he was going to get a deal. And I still think there was a deal that could have been had. And the Israelis decided that they were going to ruin that by going in and taking strikes at Iran, knowing what would follow next. And so right after the war kicked off, basically Secretary of State Marco Rubio came out and said just that. He said, well, the imminent attack was that the Israelis were going to imminently attack Iran, and then the Iranians would hit us back. And so therefore, we decided to go in ahead of time. They've come back and they've tried to clean that up. But even if you go to the official state.gov website, it's up there right now that we got involved in this war at the behest of the Israelis. And so for me, seeing all that take place, the promise I had made to myself, 20 plus years ago, we worked really hard for the first 2 weeks of the war just to try and give President Trump a couple different options for off ramps. None of those were being listened to. It was pretty clear that we were in this and that the Israelis were going to dictate much of the timeline and much of our involvement. And so I couldn't be involved in that anymore. And so I decided to resign, but not just resign, but resign publicly to come out and just be transparent with the American people, because I think this level of influence that Israel has over our actions, especially in the Middle East, the American people can see. Again, you in this room, you guys have seen this for quite some time, but I think the rest of the country is waking up and seeing this. And I think it's important that we have folks from the administration come out, especially my fellow veterans, come out and say, hey, this is not what's being sold to the American people. This isn't vital to our nation's defense. Because if we don't find an off-ramp, thank you.